Welcome back. Federal prosecutors spent years investigating former D.C. Mayor Vince Gray's 2010 campaign. The issue, whether that campaign was corrupted by an off-the-books shadow campaign that funneled big money to Mr. Gray's successful bid to unseat then-Mayor Adrian Fenty. Prosecutors extracted deals from a number of Gray associates, but never the mayor himself. And the Washington Post has new reporting that gets at why they fell short. Investigative reporter Ann Marimo joining us now from the Post's newsroom downtown. Ann, thank you very much for your time, and I want to say thank you very much for continuing to pursue this. This has been such a big deal in the city. This was a cloud that hung over the entire 4 years that Vince Gray served as mayor. There are parts of this, there are chapters of this saga that have yet to be written. They're going to play out in the weeks and months ahead, and you have clearly kept on it. Your recent story on this was on page 1 of the paper. Can you talk to us about why prosecutors felt they had a complicated situation on their hands as it related to a key figure in this whole question about whether there was a shadow campaign, an off-the-books campaign with illegal money flowing into the Gray effort to take down Adrian Fenty, and whether ultimately in a trial the credibility that jurors placed in a key witness would be a very difficult stumbling block for prosecutors?
Sure. Prosecutors were counting on former city contractor Jeffrey Thompson to be a key witness in a potential trial against the mayor. As you remember, Jeff Thompson pleaded guilty in March of 2014 to funding this illegal shadow campaign, not reporting the campaign contributions. But as they prepared their case, they had to re-examine Thompson's credibility, and we've reported that last year they began asking questions about the ages of Thompson's sexual partners to determine if they needed to charge him with additional crimes, and this delayed and possibly aborted the investigation. So
some very intimate, potentially, details about Mr. Thompson's private life were a big distraction and really the source, I guess you could say, of a side probe, a probe within a probe that prosecutors felt they had to get a handle on before they could pivot back to the whole matter of Mr. Gray?
That's right. As they were preparing for a possible trial, they needed to make sure that when they put him on the witness stand, this information about his background would not be a distraction to jurors or make jurors doubt his credibility. When the former U.S. Attorney Ron Machen left office, they had not yet decided if they were going to bring new criminal charges, and there's still many unanswered questions, but we do know that this delayed the investigation for months and may have ultimately aborted the case against the former mayor.
How long did they spend dealing with this side issue, and what was the specific concern that the prosecutors had thinking ahead to how a trial might unfold, and what sort of demerits a jury might place on a very essential witness's testimony?
Right, so Jeff Thompson's truthfulness and believability on the stand was really critical. You remember that he said in court under oath that former Mayor Gray knew about these illegal contributions, something that Gray has adamantly denied. So it was very important for Thompson to be seen as truthful on the stand, and that's why they needed to know everything they could about his background before they went ahead with a case. A former U.S. law enforcement official told us that agents had not concluded that any of Thompson's partners were underage. And folks in the office, when Machen and his successor, Vince Cohen, were there, thought that they could go ahead even with these problems in Thompson's past.
I guess all this presumes that there was nothing else that prosecutors were able to put their hands on during the course of their investigation that was the proverbial smoking gun that they could then turn to a jury and say, here is the proof, whether it was text messages, testimony from multiple other witnesses, all offering the same line of testimony, something written, a wiretap from a meeting. All of this, I gather, and your story is very long and very detailed, and we've all been reporting on this for many years now, all of this presumed that they didn't have other ways of bringing a case to a jury that would result in a win for prosecutors at the end of the process.
Well, I think we learned last week that they did have other evidence. As you know, hundreds of pages of search warrants and affidavits were unsealed at the request of the Washington Post last Friday, and it did detail for the first time more of the evidence that investigators and prosecutors were collecting, including a second witness who said Gray personally asked for this money from Thompson.
So what threads remain to be pursued? I guess Jeff Thompson, who is hoping for leniency at sentencing, that is before us. So let's focus on that. We'll come back to the question I asked a moment ago in a moment.
Sure.
Can you talk to us about the Jeff Thompson sentencing?
Sure. So that's going to happen 4 days before the Democratic primary for the D.C. Council. As you know, Vince Gray has launched a political comeback and is running for his old seat on the D.C. Council in Ward 7. Jeff Thompson's sentencing hearing is scheduled to happen 4 days before that. And at that time, we'll find out if prosecutors continue to believe his account of his interactions with Gray.
And are there other sentencings that remain?
Yes, Thompson's is the first major one. After him is a political consultant, Jean Clark Harris, who is a longtime business associate of Thompson and also a close friend of the mayor's. That will happen in July, I believe.
The campaign in question was the 2010 campaign, all the way back when Adrian Fenty was mayor. Vince Gray was chair of the D.C. Council. He got into the race late, ultimately took Adrian Fenty out in the primary, went on to serve 4 years as mayor. It has been years, and I know people are wondering, how could this thing take so long? What we're learning about the concerns prosecutors had about whether Jeff Thompson would ultimately be a credible witness in the eyes of a jury were they to bring charges against Mr. Gray. This gives us as broad a picture as probably we've had in this whole long saga about why something like this, about why this case dragged on so long.
Right, and also in the warrants last week, we saw investigators trying to shore up and corroborate testimony from other witnesses. We've seen that some other key figures, Vernon Hawkins, who is a longtime political advisor to Gray, appeared to change his story over time, and other witnesses they were counting on also had changing accounts, so this was a challenge to prosecutors.
When you say warrants, can you help us decipher what's meant by that?
Sure. So they were doing searches of email accounts and also trying to track locations of certain key figures through their cell phone information. And so this is what investigators were gathering as they put this case together.
I know your focus is on investigative reporting. You do amazing work in the pages of the Washington Post and online at WashingtonPost.com. There is very much the political question here, too, because as you note, Vince Gray is mounting a comeback. He is seeking the seat that he won to begin his political career, the Ward 7 seat on the D.C. Council. When the new federal prosecutor for the District of Columbia announced that he was going to wrap up the probe without charges against Mr. Gray, there was a sense of celebration, of resolution, of, you know, I told you all along I didn't do anything wrong, and here's the proof. In reality, there are going to be questions for Mr. Gray, one presumes, right up until the time that voters cast ballots.
Right. You're right that Vince Gray felt like he was treated very unfairly because this went on for so long and because of the timing of Jeff Thompson's plea deal that came right before his primary election that he lost to now Mayor Muriel Bowser. So he is running to what he says right and injustice. And I think that many of his supporters do feel vindicated by the fact that charges were not brought against him. It'll be interesting to see how this develops as more information comes out in the coming weeks.
Is it likely that Jeff Thompson still gets considerable consideration from prosecutors, even though he never testified?
That's the question we're all waiting to have answered. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not answering that direct question. They said you'll have to wait until sentencing. They'll provide more information then, and that's when we'll have to wait to find out.
A very interesting new set of developments in the long-running probe of the 2010 campaign of former D.C. Mayor Vince Gray. Reporter Ann Marimo of the Washington Post joining us today from the paper's newsroom downtown. And as always, we thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Bruce.
We'll step aside. We're back with more News Talk right after this.